Hi everybody, Andrew Cuneo here with a new YouTube video. Today I wanted to go over how Blue-White Control did in the recent Neon Dynasty set championship in Historic. The last video I made, I was showcasing the build of Blue-White that I was working on for the set championship that I ultimately abandoned because I thought it just wasn't good enough against Izzet Phoenix and I just didn't see a way to make it better. So I wanted to look at some of the deck lists that some of the well-known entrants in the set championship used in terms of blue-white to try to attack the historic metagame, look at how their decks are built, look at how they did, and see what we can learn about blue-white control going forward. For starters, I wanted to look at what was the metagame at the tournament, and Wizards published their Metagame Breakdown before the start of the tournament. This is what they reported, that Izzet Phoenix was the most popular deck, followed by Blue-White Control, and then Food, and then Blue-White Auras. But if you look a little bit different, or a little bit more closely, the next three entrants are kind of variants of Blue-White Control. They're Jeskai Control, Blue-White Control with Lotus Field, and Blue-White Control with Yorion. And then buried in, I guess, 9th place on this slide is a different version of Auras, white-black instead of blue-white. So really, if you're looking at what you should be preparing your deck to face, blue-white control style mirrors is actually one of the most important matchups. I would say that's an important matchup. Also, Izzet Phoenix is an important matchup. And Food, which I thought was an important matchup, really isn't any more important than Auras. And also, based on the results of this tournament, overall, Food did not do particularly well. So I think that's going to fall down even further in terms of importance. Rakdos Arcanist style decks actually had a couple of really strong finishes, so you'd probably move that up a little bit on the list. So while we're looking at these decks, I think the thing to really focus on is going to be what's their plan against Phoenix, what's their plan in mirrors, and what's their plan against Auras, what's their plan against Arcanist. The Food matchup is less important than I would have guessed. We've got the results of the tournament at this point. And if you look at this matrix, you can see that Azorius Control did not do particularly well. It had a sub 50% win rate while being a decent sized chunk of the tournament. And if you look at what did it do well against, the answer is it did well against Azorius Auras, and it did well against Jeskai Control, and it didn't actually have a winning record against any of the other major archetypes. Some of that is just going to be, I think, because of the smaller sample. I don't really think that Blue-White Control is disadvantaged against Golgari Food. So that sub 50% win rate there kind of surprises me, and I'm not sure I believe it. I'd want to see more data before I became convinced. But like the really, really low win rate against Rakdos Arcanist, it is a small sample, but I do think you're a dog in that matchup. I do think if you play against a blue-white deck that has Lotus Field in it, you're just going to be inherently disadvantaged. So I certainly believe those things. Also, we can see that it had a 44.9% win rate against Izzet Phoenix, which I think that's believable. I think kind of no matter what you do to Azorius Control, you're always going to be a little bit behind Phoenix, and at least this data bears that out. But let's look at some of the deck lists now and just see how people try to approach solving these problems and see if we can learn any better ways to build blue-white control. So for starters, this is the list that I showed in my last video. This is not what I played at the set championship. I played Tainted Pact, but this is the point I left the deck at when I decided that I did not want to play it. So this is kind of my stopping point. Things to note here is there's a Rest in Peace in the main deck, which is trying to make the deck good against Phoenix. It's also good against Arcanist. It's good against Food to an extent. So I think that this hits a big chunk of the format, so you're happy to play it. We've got a lot of March of Otherworldly Lights in the main deck. The sweeper package I was working with was 2 Divine Purges, a Wrath, and a Farewell. Narsets in the main deck, some Memory Deluges, some Shark Typhoons. And then in the sideboard, no Nezahal, some more sweepers. So this is kind of this is the baseline for me. This isn't the baseline for anybody else, but this is the baseline for what I thought about the deck. Let's move on and look at some of the actual competitors' deck lists. Let's start with Shota Yasuoka's blue-white list. Shota was the top finishing competitor who played blue-white in Historic. He finished 10th. His record in Historic was only 4-4. You have to remember this is a split format event. Rounds 4 through 7 and rounds 12 through 15 were the Historic rounds. There was also 7 rounds of Alchemy mixed in. So Shota did better in Alchemy than he did in Historic. If you look at his matchups, he beat blue-white auras twice. He lost to Phoenix. He lost twice to Rakdos decks. One of the Rakdos decks is more like a food deck. It had Cat Oven in it and also Oni Cult Anvil. The other one was a Rakdos Arcanist deck. So I don't know that there's much surprising in his results. It certainly kind of matches with what we saw when we looked at the overall win rates in the Matrix for blue-white. Looking at the construction of his deck, a couple of things spring out. First of all, he's got 4 March of Otherworldly Lights. I think that's going to be a common theme that we're going to see pretty much everybody registered 4 copies of March of Otherworldly Light. We've also got a copy of the Wandering Emperor. I think that's going to be another common theme looking at these lists. One thing that is unusual about this list, though, there's no Divine Purge in the 75, and that allows you to play Portable Holes, because you really can't have Portable Hole and Divine Purge in your deck at the same time, because Divine Purge destroys the Portable Hole, which puts whatever you Portable Hole back into play. You definitely don't want your sweeper to be doing that. So that's interesting to note, and if we look in the sideboard, we've got 2 more Portable Holes, so the full 4 Portable Holes in the 75. That is definitely a card that is going to help you a ton against blue-white auras because it gets around their Selfless Spirit. Divine Purge also gets around the Selfless Spirit, but it is much less effective against auras because it gives them a creature they can replay. Also, it costs 3 mana instead of just 1 mana, which is a massive difference in the matchup. Should have had only 2 Narsets and 1 Memory Deluge and only 3 Teferi. So actually a little bit light on the card draw. And also a main deck Mystical Dispute, which that looks pretty good if 2 of the big decks you're trying to attack are Izzet Phoenix and other blue-white decks. That makes a lot of sense. There's also a split of Censors and Jwari Disruptions, which that was something I wasn't really sure about what the right mix of those things to do is. Here we've got 1 Jwari Disruption, 2 Censors, which maybe that's good. I'm not really sure. We also have only 1 Fateful Absence in the main deck, which that's what I was doing as well. I think if you're planning to play a lot of blue-white mirrors, Fateful Absence is pretty good because it gives you a way to catch up in terms of mana efficiency if your opponent manages to get a Teferi on board. We've got 4 copies of Shark Typhoon, which is another thing that's good in the blue-white mirror. I'm a little bit torn as to whether or not Shark Typhoon is good against Izzet Phoenix. It certainly doesn't help you at all against their really good draws, but if you're able to slow them down, if you're able to get a Rest in Peace in play, it pretty quickly becomes a very strong card against their deck. So I can see it making sense to play a lot of them. His sweeper package is 1 Day of Judgment, 1 Wrath of God, 1 Farewell, and if we look at the sideboard, there are no other sweepers. So this is a list that's very light on sweepers overall, I would say. 3 in the main deck, none in the sideboard is about as low as I've seen someone go. But realistically, the sweepers just aren't very good. Against Phoenix, they're really expensive. And if you're sweeping the Arclight Phoenixes, especially with a Wrath, they're pretty likely to come back the next turn in a lot of circumstances, so it's not that exciting. Divine Purge doesn't really do much against Phoenix. It hits 2 of their creatures out of the variety of creatures that they're going to be casting. It only hits the Dragon's Rage Channeler and the Sprite Dragon, which normally there's maybe 6 copies of those cards total in their deck. And then you don't hit the namesake art like Phoenix, you don't hit the Stormwing Entity, you don't hit Crackling Drake, you don't hit the Ox. So obviously Divine Purge is really bad against Phoenix. Other than that, if we look at what's the sideboard plan against Phoenix, we've got a 3rd Rest in Peace. I'm not a huge fan of that. I think it's pretty easy for the Phoenix decks to play game plans where Rest in Peace doesn't actually hurt them that much. But it does support the rest of Shota's plan, which is to board in Baneslayer Angel and Lyra Dawnbringer in this matchup. And by having Rest in Peace, you shut off their Unholy Heats. So they can no longer Unholy Heat Baneslayer Angel or Lyra once you get a Rest in Peace in play to make sure they never have Delirium. I don't think I really like that plan. It is a plan, at least, I would say. My problem with it, though, is that the Phoenix decks are going to have Mystical Disputes in their sideboard, which it's pretty hard to get one of these Angels in play through a Mystical Dispute. They also are going to have Otawara in their deck, generally. If they're only playing blue-red, they're going to have Otawara. My teammates played blue-red with a black splash in the sideboard, so they didn't have Otawara. But Otawara is it's not a great answer to these Angels, but if you're really relying on the Angel to block the turn it comes down, which a lot of the games are going to play out like that, and they have an Otawara or a Brazen Borrower, it kind of ruins your sideboard plan. So I'm not wild about that plan. Other notable things about the sideboard, there's a Commence the Endgame in the sideboard, which that is something that was popular for a while and really fell off a ton because it's really easy to lose a game if you play Commence the Endgame, make like a 9/9, and they steal it with Archmage's Charm before you untap. That's something that, I'm not saying Commence the Endgame is bad, but it's something you really have to be aware of when you're going to be playing with this card, because you don't want to lose games where you could play around an Archmage's Charm. It's still going to be a strong card if you get pretty late into the game, but if you're playing it on 6 mana into their untapped mana, it is a little bit scary. We also have Malevolent Hermits. I think that's an excellent sideboard card in the mirror. That is something that would definitely appeal to me about this list. And then we have some Aether Gust, which is just generally a good card, but I don't think lines up great in the metagame. I've never been a huge fan of having this in my deck against Phoenix. It's serviceable, but I think you just have much better options usually. I would certainly prefer to have all of my Mystical Disputes in my deck before I would have any Aether Gusts, and I would prefer to have all my March of Otherworldly Lights in my deck. I think from watching the matchup, Shota did have some Aether Gusts in his deck. The one time he played Phoenix, which I'm not in love with. It makes sense if the Phoenix person you know has a bunch of Chandras in their sideboard. So overall, I guess the thing I would say about this list is it doesn't look like it's doing anything particularly good against Phoenix. I do think it's probably pretty good against auras because of the main deck portable holes. I do think it's a little slanted to winning in the mirror because of the 4 main deck Shark Typhoons and the main deck Mystical Dispute. Those are all good things. One other thing that I didn't point out in my list, but we can start looking at here, is the lands. We've got 2 Castle Vantresses, 2 Hall of Storm Giants, and a White Castle. As I said in my video when I was talking about my build, I hate the second copy of Castle Vantress. I think it's just not a card you activate very often, and it has the potential to screw up your mana if it comes into play tapped, because it doesn't always come into play untapped. It also doesn't provide you with a second white mana, and you have a lot of white cards in your deck. And I also think the Castle Ardenvale is pretty bad. One thing I will say about Castle Ardenvale is if you are actually going to be playing blue-white mirrors like 25 to 30%, 5% of the time, it makes some amount of sense. It doesn't even really do that much for you in the game ones, but in the sideboarded games where people don't have bad cards in their deck and there's lots of Dovin's vetoes, so it can be hard to resolve your spells at times, having kind of an uncounterable thing to make 1/1s to pressure their planeswalkers occasionally matters. I'm still not sold that it's worth it, but it does make a little bit more sense if you're playing in a metagame where there's a lot of blue-white control. All right, let's move on to the next list, which is going to be Mistman's. And if we look at his deck, Mistman has... I think he got into competitive Magic from being a streamer. I'm not entirely sure what his background is. He finished 22nd, which is a very strong finish. And I think this may have been his first set championship. I don't know his background. He's certainly not in the Hall of Fame like Shota is. He frequently has somewhat different takes on how to build his decks. If you look at his results, he went 4-4 with blue-white control. So he's another person who had more success in Alchemy than in Historic. So this is another thing where this is one of the highest finishing blue-white decks, but again, the bulk of the good finish comes from Alchemy, not from blue-white. If you look at how he did in the individual matches, he lost twice to Phoenix. So again, Phoenix is beating up on blue-white. He went 4-1 in control style mirrors. So let's look at his deck to see why that might be. And right away you can see 2 Mystical Disputes. Pretty big deal if you're going to be playing blue-white mirrors. And kind of bizarrely, only two Teferis, which Teferi is kind of the way that your deck wins, but it also can lead to somewhat clunky hands if you draw too many of them. 2 Memory Deluges in the main deck with 2 Mystical Disputes and 3 Narsets. Those are all cards that are good in blue-white mirrors. And then we've got 2 Shark Typhoons, which that is not going to... That's not the number you'd want to see if you're trying to focus on blue-white mirrors. Looking at some other stuff, we've got 1 Rest in Peace, 1 Relic of Progenitus, so yet another main deck Rest in Peace. I don't know if I pointed it out. Should actually had 2 main deck copies, because people really wanted to make the blue-white deck beat Phoenix, and they tried, and I still think that it just always comes up short is the problem. We've got 4 March of Otherworldly Lights again. That's kind of a mainstay of this archetype at this point, I would say. 4 Divine Purges, which it's not surprising you lost to Phoenix twice if you have 4 Divine Purges in your main deck. It's just not a good card in that matchup. Overall, I really like Shota's approach of just not playing Divine Purge at all and playing Portable Hole instead. I think it serves you better against Phoenix and better against Auras. And Portable Hole is good against food-style decks. I would say it's maybe not as good as Divine Purge, but it's still good. There's a 1 of Exclude, which that's a really weird inclusion, I gotta say. I guess this is... I'm not really sure what the logic is behind including this card. There just aren't a lot of cards played in Historic that are really juicy targets for Exclude, because you're really hoping to hit like a 3 or 4 mana creature that your opponent's casting. So maybe out of Phoenix you're going to see that some of the time, but I think you're not really going to see that often. Looking at the lands, there's only 1 Castle Vantress. I'm a fan of that. We've got 1 Field of Ruin with how many basics in the deck? 2 islands and no plains. I'm not wild about that. And then we've got 1 Castle Ardenvale, which, like I said, I think that is not a card I would be excited to play, but somewhat reasonable if you're going to be playing blue-white control mirrors. So yeah, pretty standard in the land front. Looking at the sideboard. Now the sideboard is also where things get kind of unusual. We've got 4 Wedding Announcements and a Teferi Time Raveler. And remember, Mistman went 4-1 against other blue-white control style decks. So this is potentially where a lot of those wins came from, is this 4 Wedding Announcement plus a Teferi Time Raveler sideboard plus a 3rd Mystical Dispute and 2 more copies of Dovin's Veto for a total of 3. So we've got a lot of strong sideboard options against the mirror. And this is also, Wedding Announcement is nice in that it doesn't get hit that hard by Mystical Disputes, which is a pretty big deal in the mirror. You don't want to be in spots where you're trying to jam you're trying to jam permanents onto the board and they're just getting Mystical Disputed, because it makes it just really hard to win counterfights in that scenario. Also, we've got the 3rd Shark Typhoon. So pretty clearly Mistmint had a good plan for how to win the blue-white mirrors. And if you look at the construction of the main deck, with 4 Divine Purges and a Wrath and a Day of Judgment in the main deck, that's 6 sweepers you want to cut. So you need to have a lot of cards to board in. And also, you don't need a ton of help against kind of creature decks. Like if you were playing against a Gruul or a Merfolk or something, you certainly don't need more help in the sideboard when you have this much in the main deck. Other interesting thing to note about this sideboard is, again, we've got the Baneslayer Angel, this time with only a 2nd Rest in Peace. So it's going to have the same support where there's a decent chance you're going to be able to shut off Delirium, so the Baneslayer isn't going to just die to Unholy Heat. But it's still the same problem that the Phoenix decks are going to be boarding in Mystical Disputes. They're going to have Brazen Borrowers. They're going to have Otawara. So this thing is not... You can't just tap 5 mana and put this thing into play and expect it to win for you. So I continue to think that this is just not really the answer for blue-white beating Phoenix. We do have an Ether Gust and a Cerulean Drake. Cerulean Drake is actually a pretty strong card against Phoenix a lot of the time because it's pretty hard for them to get it off the board efficiently. They do have the Brazen Borrower and the Otawara, and they can Mystical Dispute it, but here we're talking about a 2-mana play rather than a 5-mana play in the case of the Baneslayer Angel. So this is a little bit of tech against Phoenix, and we've also got an Ether Gust, which is a generally great card, but I don't think it lines up that well with the format where I think you really want to be maximizing this slot for cards that are going to specifically help you against Phoenix. And I think Ether Gust is just passable against Phoenix. It's not great. We've got one Archon of Absolution, which this is something that Mistman frequently plays, which I'm assuming this is, basically just to beat white weenie decks. It might also be serviceable if you're against like one of those blue-white affinity decks. A lot of at least the Esper Sentinels are white in that deck. We've got one copy of Farewell in the sideboard, which is yet another sweeper. So I think this is just mostly an anti-food card when you see it in the sideboard. So that certainly makes sense to have access to in your 75. When you've got 4 Divine Purges in your main deck, I would say you probably don't need the Farewell as much, but it's still good. So I guess the main takeaway I have from this list is that this is probably a good sideboard package for winning blue-white mirrors. I still think that this is not the answer if you want to beat Phoenix decks. And I also think that this list is going to be meaningfully worse against the Auras decks than Shoja's list was. But maybe I should try out this wedding announcement plan from the sideboard for the mirrors at least. All right, moving on to the final deck. We've got Decklist from Matt Sperling. Matt Sperling is a viewer of the channel and also a former teammate of mine. Matt finished 87th in the tournament, but he did do much better in Historic than he did in Alchemy. He went 6-2 in Historic. And if we look at the matchups he got, he beat Food 3 times. So he got to play against Food a lot, which I think is the deck you really wanted to target if you were going to register blue-white for this tournament. The results in that matrix notwithstanding, I still think you want to play against Food if you register blue-white control. He only went 2-2 in blue-white mirrors. The things I'm classifying as mirrors are basically like any sort of Teferi deck. So he had to play twice against Lotus Field decks, and I think Lotus Field decks are just pretty comfortably ahead in the mirror because it's so easy for them to get a mana advantage if they're able to cheat a Lotus Field into play, and then the mana advantage tends to spiral out of control. He also lost to Brad Nelson in a mirror, and I believe they were playing the exact same 75, so I don't know that we can really draw much from the results of that mirror. But let's look at how the deck was constructed. So one thing immediately jumps out, and that is Kahira as a companion. I like this a lot. I didn't have this in my initial list, and I think that was a mistake. I think if I was going to work on this deck some more, I would plan on having Kahira as a companion. I think the cost is just really low, and I think it gives you a bit of an edge in the mirror that you just have this kind of free card that your opponent can't ignore, because so much of the mirror is about keeping planeswalkers on the board. And also, I think it just, it's going to give you value in a lot of matchups. It's something to do as the game drags on. And just the cost of one sideboard card is really not that high. If you're getting this card for free, you should probably be playing it. It does have a minor synergy that you can get it into your hand and then eventually pitch it to March of Otherworldly Light. But if you think about it, you're spending 3 mana to put it in your hand, and then it's only saving you 2 mana when you discard. So that's really not going to come up very much. But I do like the inclusion. I think that was something I overlooked when I was building the deck, and I think it's pretty smart to play. 4 copies of March of Otherworldly Light. Again, like I said, I think this is basically all versions of this deck going forward are going to have 4 copies of this card. We've got a main deck Rest in Peace again. Here, the other 2-mana spells are pretty interesting. We have no Dovin's Veto. We have 4 Jwari Disruptions, no Censor. So that's a pretty clear statement that they prefer Jwari Disruption over Censor. And I think they just also have a lot of lands in their deck. They've got 25 actual lands plus 4 Jwari Disruptions. I didn't look at that specifically in the other list, but I think if we counted these as lands, they're going to have 1 or 2 more lands than anybody else. And also 2 Fateful Absences. I think that this does give you a slight advantage in mirrors if you just have a second card that can get a Teferi off the board. We've got 1 Divine Purge in the main deck, 1 Day of Judgment, 1 Farewell is the sweeper package. So again, 3 sweepers. I'm kind of not wild about this sweeper package. I think that you can do better than Divine Purge. I was impressed by Shota, the fact that Shota just didn't include it in his deck. If you're going to play Portable Hull, it does kind of get a little bit in the way of Farewell, specifically in the food matchup, because you may get in a spot where you don't want to exile artifacts, so you may wind up leaving them with some ovens. You still are always going to get cats if that scenario comes up, because you can exile creatures from play and exile the graveyard, so the cat isn't going to be able to dodge the Farewell. And you can get enchantments, so you're going to be getting Trail of Crumbs. So that's pretty good. I think that Divine Purge just isn't a good enough card. I know this is a really controversial card where some people think it's like broken and it should be nerfed. And I think I'm definitely in the camp that it's just not even clear it's a playable card in any circumstances. So I think that of the three or 4 builds we looked at, I liked Shota's approach to the sweepers the best, which is no Divine Purge and then play Portable Holes in your 75. Another interesting thing about Matt's deck is he has a lot of Planeswalkers. He's got the full 4 Narsets, 3 Wandering Emperors, full 4 Teferis. So this is, I think, a way to get an edge in the blue-white mirrors. Matt only went 2 and 2 in the blue-white mirrors, but remember he did play what I believe was a 75-card exact mirror and lose. And he also lost to the blue-white field deck, which the field version of the mana base, I think, gives you an edge in the mirror. So I think that this is actually a list that's pretty good in the mirror. And we've got a main deck Mystical Dispute. Perhaps you could think of the main deck Mystical Dispute as being in place of the main deck Dovin's Veto, which I think that this is also a thing that's pretty smart to do if you're planning to play mostly against Phoenix and other blue-white control decks, because I think Mystical Dispute's pretty clearly better than Dovin's Veto in that specific matchup. I do think you give up a little bit in the food matchup if you switch a Dovin's Veto to a Mystical Dispute. Narset used to be really strong against Phoenix. I think that the fact that Brainstorm got banned and they basically have considers where they used to have Brainstorms makes it so Narset is less of a lights out card against the Phoenix decks. It's still strong. I think it's still a card that you want to play a lot of copies in the main deck. So I certainly wouldn't be against playing 4. And then this is also a list that pretty clearly these guys thought the Wandering Emperor was great, and they've got 4 copies in their main, or 3 copies in their main deck. So, and that's something that I think is pretty reasonable. Looking at the lands, we've got only 1 Castle Mantras. I'm a fan. We do have the Castle Ardenvale, which I'm not sure I'm a fan of that. But this is a mana base that looks reasonable to me. Checking out the sideboard, we've got some unusual cards. We've got an Unsubstantiate, which I guess is... I'm not really sure why this is here, to be honest. I mean, it works against uncounterable cards like Nezahal and Thought Distortion in that it puts the spell back in their hand. It's not a long-term solution, but it is a short-term solution. And it's a bounce spell against like Sharks. So maybe, I mean, they don't have any Brazen Borrowers. So pretty clearly their thought process was that being able to return a spell to the owner's hand is better than a Brazen Borrower. Which I don't know that I agree with that, but it is what it is. I mean, this is what they did. They've got a full 4 Mystical Disputes, which that's a pretty big statement about Mystical Disputes. They have a commit in the sideboard, which, especially if you're going to play 4 Narsets, I kind of would like to see this in the main deck. I don't know what I would like to see it over, but I think that commit is a strong enough main deck card. We've got 1 Devout Decree in the sideboard, which this just strikes me as weird. I don't know why you would think you would need this. I guess this is a plan against Rakdos Arcanist is perhaps the argument. It's certainly, if you're going to play a Divine Purge based deck so you can't play Portable Hole, you would like to have something that can answer a Dreadhorde Arcanist on turn 2 for 2 mana for the games where you're on the draw, and I guess this solves that problem. They don't have any Ether Gusts, which Ether Gust also does solve that problem. I'm not a fan of any of those things. I think just trying to build your deck based around Portable Hole is better. Against the Arcanist decks, Portable Hole is a little bit dangerous in that it gets hit by Baffling End. So or not Baffling End, sorry. It gets hit by Kolaghan's Decree, Kolaghan's Command. So you might want to look at Baffling End instead. That was a really confusing idea that I just tried to explain. Basically, Kolaghan's Command is bad, or Kolaghan's Command is good against Portable Hole. Baffling End is good against Kolaghan's Command because it cannot be hit by Kolaghan's Command is what I'm trying to say. So I think that I would prefer to Baffling End here. Certainly if you know there's going to be so much auras going forward, Baffling End is better in that matchup than Devout Decree. So I think that that would have been a nice change to be able to make. Other than that, we got more Divine Purges. I really... 2 more Divine Purges and a Farewell on the sideboard. I don't think you need this much stuff against food, is what I would say to that. Like, I think that if you're going to play blue-white, you want to have a good matchup against food. I don't think you need this much in the sideboard to make it a good matchup, though. So what's the takeaway from this deck, I guess? I think that the interesting things that stand out about this deck to me are, number 1, the Kahira. I think that's a standout compared to all the other lists we've looked at. Lots of copies of the Wandering Emperor. That is something that I think is certainly worth exploring. That could be a good adaptation to make. The 4 Jawari Disruptions, I'm not sold that's great, but maybe it is. I'd have to play with that. Main deck Mystical Dispute, kind of in place of a Dovin's Veto. That sounds like a good idea to me. 4 Narsets, I'm not sure about that one either. That's another thing I'd want to play with to get a better feel for it. Like, I think Narset's a good card against Phoenix, but I don't think that maxing out at, like, going up to 4 really helps you that much against Phoenix. This deck in particular didn't... I guess Devout Decree is another card you can play against Phoenix. This doesn't feel like a list that would be advantaged against Phoenix to me either. So I haven't seen anything in any of these lists that changes my opinion that Phoenix is just good against blue-white. Like, it doesn't feel like any of these lists have solved that particular problem. I do think that these lists, you know, they show a variety of approaches for how to try to win the blue-white mirror, which I think that's useful. And I think they also show a variety of approaches to how you might want to fight food, which I think there's a variety of viable ways to do that. I think if you're looking at fighting auras, Shota had the best list for fighting auras. So if I was to look at blue-white going forward, I think that what I would do is I would look at Shota's list, and I would want to add a Kahira to the sideboard to start. And I'm not sold on this plan, the Angels plan versus Phoenix. I would still hope to find something better, which I don't know what that better thing is. And I think if you want to actually elevate blue-white control to being like a tier 1 or a tier 0 deck in Historic, you need to figure out how to have a good matchup against Phoenix, or you need Faithless Looting to be banned from Historic, which I think is something that It's probably going to happen eventually. I don't know that it's going to happen in the short term, though. Anyway, I hope you guys found this useful. If you did, please leave a comment, because it was comments on, I did a video like this about control decks in Alchemy about a month ago, and it was all the feedback I got from that video that caused me to make this video. So if you like this, if you found it useful, please leave a comment and please sub to the channel. Thanks for watching.